By the late 1970s, the Cold War had violently spilled into the dust and heat of the Angolan bushveld. For the South African apartheid government, the threat across the border was framed as absolute. They called it the total onslaught, or Roy Gavar, the Red Danger. Soviet-backed proxy forces, bolstered by tens of thousands of heavily armed Cuban troops, were massing just to the north. But just as the conflict escalated, the United Nations passed Resolution 418. It was a mandatory arms embargo. Overnight, South Africa's access to Western military hardware was entirely severed. This created an immediate, fatal tactical disadvantage. South African forces were relying on World War II-era 25-pounder artillery. The Angolan and Cuban forces were equipped with modern Soviet 130mm field guns and BM-21 Grad rockets. The Soviet weapons had a massively superior reach, allowing them to strike South African positions with impunity from miles away. Pushed into a corner, the state fell back on an old, deeply ingrained cultural philosophy, a Boer maak 'n plan, a farmer makes a plan. It is an ethos of sheer improvisation under pressure. To survive absolute global isolation, the government realized it could no longer buy a military machine to fight this proxy war. It had to engineer one entirely from scratch. The government turned to Arms Corps, the centralized state armaments corporation. Backed by highly classified, massive funding, Arms Corps launched a crash development program to build an indigenous arsenal. One major creation was the G6 Rhino. Foreign self-propelled guns ran on tracks, but South African engineers built the G6 on 6 massive wheels to deploy rapidly across the savannah. Its deep V-shaped hull deflected anti-tank mine blasts, keeping the crew alive. Meanwhile, the Air Force was losing the sky to advanced Soviet MiG-23s. Under extreme secrecy, South Africa collaborated with Israeli engineers to rebuild aging planes. The result was the Atlas Cheetah, heavily upgraded with the radar and missile technology required to maintain air parity. These weapons transcended their tactical value on the battlefield. They were elevated into potent cultural symbols, proving to a besieged society that a small, isolated nation could out-engineer the global superpowers attempting to cut them off. But hardware is useless without operators. To sustain a prolonged war, the state systematically conditioned young white males from childhood. Schools implemented youth preparedness programs designed to instill intense physical discipline and unquestioning patriotism. To legitimize mandatory conscription, military leaders directly appropriated the 19th century myth of the Boer commando. They framed the modern draft as a direct continuation of the rugged, independent pioneers who had historically defended the frontier on horseback. Inside the training camps, the reality was brutal. The military enforced an unforgiving, hyper-vigilant masculinity. The intense fear of being labeled weak or ostracized by peers forced young men to suppress emotional vulnerability and conform perfectly to the state's ideal warrior archetype. These conscripts, known as troupes, were shipped to the border. They were thrust into a terrifyingly vast, hostile terrain, forced to navigate minefields and guerrilla ambushes thousands of miles from home. Out in the physical isolation of the deep bush, the grand political narratives of the state quickly evaporated. A soldier's survival depended entirely on the mechanical reliability of his weapon and an inescapable, desperate brotherhood with the men in his trench. By 1988, the conflict ground to a massive, bloody stalemate at the Battle of Cuito-Cuanavale. Following the historic tripartite accord, the South African forces quietly packed up their heavy armor and finally withdrew. The conscripts returned to an unrecognizable reality. Almost immediately after the troops crossed back over the border, the political architects of the war began dismantling the apartheid state and the exact ideologies these soldiers had been ordered to defend. This caused a severe psychological whiplash. Stripped of the ideological justification for their actions and the sacrifices of their peers, an entire generation of veterans was left grappling with epidemic levels of undiagnosed post-traumatic stress and profound moral injury. In the new democratic South Africa, the military they served in carried an immense political stigma. Veterans retreated into total silence, unable to publicly process their trauma in a society eager to move on. The total strategy was engineered by the state to physically protect and unify the Afrikaner identity. Instead, the crucible of the border war fractured it entirely, leaving a diaspora of veterans permanently isolated by the ghosts of a forgotten war.